So hi and welcome to Healing Solidarity, a conference about reimagining international development. I'm the conference initiator, Marianne Clements. I'm also a writer and consultant and facilitator of the Replenishment Room. And in this conversation, you'll hear me talking with Nomvula Dlamini, who's the executive director of CDRA based in South Africa. And you'll hear about Nomvula's background in education and how it inspired her interest in learning, which has since led obviously to the work of CDRA and also their barefoot guides that many of you may know about. In this conversation, I was really inspired by the way in which Nomvula calls us really into recalling our shared humanity and making that the central focus of how we do our work for social change and justice in the world. I hope you'll be inspired by this conversation as I was when I was having it with Nomvula. Enjoy. So, hi Nomvula. What do you want to tell me about yourself?
I think, let me start with, you mentioned your frustrations. Let me start with what I'm experiencing, what I've been experiencing over the last, let's say over the last week. Mm-hmm. As you are aware, or as I imagine most people all over the world are aware that South Africa is preparing tomorrow to celebrate the centenary birthday of the late Nelson Mandela.
Yeah.
So what one has been hearing a lot over the last week, over the last month, over the last few months is a lot of talk about Nelson Mandela and the values he espoused and the kind of leadership he offered the country and the world. Yeah. So that's what I'm hearing. And I've spent the last few days really reflecting very deeply on this. Mm-hmm. He espoused and the kind of leadership that he brought or he offered South Africa at a time when he was still alive. But you know, his humanity, his humility, his care for children, for the people of South Africa, his generosity. So you hear a lot about that, how inclusive he was in his approach, and so there's a lot of talk about these values which Madiba held very, very dearly. But I find myself very frustrated.
Yeah.
Because like, if these values are so important, why should we just be talking about them? Why does the governing party in South Africa, the African National Congress, the ANC, why is the ANC not embracing these values and working to create a better South Africa?
Mm-hmm.
So there's no congruence, there's no connection between the talking about these values and the living of these values. So I find myself very frustrated, and the conversations that I have been a part of over the last couple of days was very much around values and the kind of work that we do.
Yeah.
Myself deeply challenged by the work that we do. I have been working in the social sector for the best part of 20 years, and it has been work that is aimed at bringing about positive social change. It has been work that is aimed about transforming our society. It is work that is about creating a just society.
Yeah.
And I find myself reflecting on what do these values actually mean for those of us and our organizations that are aimed at creating a just society. I am I find myself very frustrated because I am like, are we still, is there still deep commitment to the creation of just societies? And those of us who do the work and who believe very deeply in the work that we do, is it still worthwhile to continue doing what we are trying to do? How do we create just societies? So this is the work that I've been doing for the last 20 years. And the CDRA, the organization of which I'm a part, has afforded me a platform to pursue the creation of just societies, the creation of a more human world. So even though most of our work is about supporting organizations, it's really trying to create organizations that are more human. Creating organizations that are more human. Creating organizations that can help to enhance and to strengthen the humanity of others, creating organizations that are helping people to form more human connections. So this is the work that I am doing. I work as a social facilitator. That is how I describe myself. And at the heart of the work that I do and my organization does is really facilitating humanizing processes that enable others, whether they be in groups, whether they be in organizations, whether they be in collaborations, whether they be in stakeholder engagements, whether it be the engagement between government agencies and citizens, whether they be engagements between local municipalities and the citizens. It's how do we design and facilitate processes that are a lot more humanizing. Yeah. And the work that we do, although it is grounded in South Africa, it happens in different parts of we work anywhere in the world beyond the boundaries of South Africa. My background is in education. I was thinking the other day and thinking back to when I was still working as a secondary school teacher. I did that for 12 years. And I left just at the time when things were starting to change in the country, where we could see that we are heading for the end of apartheid, and preparing ourselves for the creation of the democratic South Africa. So I left around that time, and then I moved and I started working for NGOs. The first NGO I worked for was doing work in teacher development. And part of that was supporting schools in their development, in their growth, and in their learning. And around that time, I was introduced to the concept of whole school development. And that triggered my interest in organization development. And thereafter, I moved into the CDRA and have been there since then. But of course, when I left behind formal education and I started working in the NGO sector, at the same time I developed a real interest in adult learning and adult learning practices, and how adult learning and adult education can become really a stimulus, or can contribute to processes of change and transformation. So I've been living in the social sector for a very long time now, and still believing that the work that we do the work that CDRA does and the work that others in the world do, underpinned by a justice agenda, still believing very strongly that this work is needed in the world. And though we might not be able to change the world, we might be able to change our small little worlds where we,
yeah. I think it's so interesting, your reflection on what's happening in South Africa at the moment, and this thing about values, because I think in organizations, I think about it a lot, like what happens in that place where like what the values that we can all say, yeah, we share that, we are committed to whatever it is. Often these big things, ending poverty or whatever that is in an organization, women's rights, big and difficult ideas. And then somewhere it gets like lost, almost like lost in translation.
Yeah.
And the organization doesn't even feel that human. I love that idea of humanizing, right?
Yeah. And I think if through the work that we do, a lot of what we hear and what we see in our engagement, in our accompaniment of organizations is just the total absence, irrespective of the values that are embraced in an organization, but the total absence of a recognition of the humanity of others. It's so common these days for people to say, to hear people say, I don't feel appreciated. I don't feel there is recognition for what I do. So whilst we are able to talk about the values and to even list the values, living the values is very difficult. So we come from that our work is a commitment to creating a just society, a society where there's justice. But I think more importantly these days is how do we create societies, organizations, where the humanity of each and every person is actually recognized, where humanity is respected, where the humanity of people, of others is respected and appreciated. So I mean, the world, our small worlds as well as the big world in which we all live, is just the absence of the humanity of others. And if you think of the poverty that we are experiencing these days, it's a poverty that is deeply dehumanizing.
Yeah, it's only possible in a way because of we don't share an understanding of people's humanity. Maybe, I don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, we can't even recognize and appreciate the common humanity that unites us. Unites us. So it's very interesting. Yeah.
When you go into organizations, what things do you find like make a difference to this? And I know that it's a journey and not a kind of quick fix. But
what are the things that make a difference to organizations?
In terms of people beginning to have this sense of, a shared humanity being a crucial thing, within in a space where it might, it doesn't feel present.
Yeah. What I find, or what is common that one is able to pick up in the work that we do with organizations is there's such a busyness. Busyness in organizations, and it's all about getting the work done. The work needs to be done, and there is not enough of really stopping and pausing and just to recognize each other. So people have become very busy, but busy at the expense of, even the relationships through which we are connected.
Mm.
So there's no real appreciation for the relationships through which we are connected. Don't even take it to the level of recognizing each other as human beings, but just the relationships through which we are connected. So the emphasis and the focus tends to be on getting things done.
Yeah.
The work needs to get done. And that is done that is achieved at the expense of the relationships through which we engage, the relationships through which we relate, the relationships through which we are connected. And for me, from the work that we do, that seems to be it's a common thread that runs. So what we hear more and more of is people saying, I don't feel appreciated.
Yeah.
You hear people say that we never ever even think about the relationships that we are cultivating within the organization amongst ourselves. What we hear most of the time is people feeling disconnected.
Mm-hmm.
So they do. There is action. There's a doing, but at a kind of a real human relational element, people are completely disconnected. So we work a lot with organizations that are populated by people, by human beings, but where there is such very deep feelings of disconnection. So that is a kind of a common thread in organizations. Yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of trying to bring that back, like, what kind of approaches do you take? I don't know why I say bringing it back, because I don't know whether it's ever been there in the first place, but I don't know, I still have this idea that maybe one day somewhere back there we understood that better, but I don't know if that's really true. That might be my
No, it's not. I think if we think back to a few decades, I think, and I want to link this to your focus on international development. I think there were genuine relationships of solidarity.
Yeah.
There were genuinely relationships of solidarity, and they were relationships of a particular quality.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about some of the organizations that we work with, collaborate with, there is such an emphasis on or maybe not even an emphasis. Unconsciously, the focus tends to be on collaborating around projects.
Yeah.
And what needs to be done, but not having, without the genuine relationships of solidarity.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I'm making sense.
Yeah, you make sense to me.
So collaborations are built around projects, but the relational element, particularly the relational element that is about solidarity. I'm in solidarity with you around a social cause. It's not there, and we all struggle with how do we rebuild? How do we even reclaim that?
Yeah. I tend to think we've lost it somehow collectively. In some way, I feel like the way we get funding has been part of it. I don't know. And in some way, the way organizations have felt they need to build some kind of almost corporate structures, especially the bigger ones. But even smaller ones feel the pressure, I think, to do that around funding and kind of how they present themselves in the space. And I feel like, you know, it's an open question for me, like, is it, you know, how that can be reclaimed given the pressures on people in organizations that just seem to take up so much of their headspace, right? But yeah, I do. You make perfect sense to me. I feel like, you know, there's a million projects where organizations are working together to try and deliver X amount of workshops, right? Yeah. You kind of know that. But very little like standing together. You know, that's what I was thinking when you said solidarity. You know, I really think of like, what does it mean just to stand together or to stand alongside someone and support whatever it is they need to do, you know, not the project, but the person and the ideas and the cause.
Yeah, absolutely. It's even as organizations, the lives of organizations have been taken over by what we sometimes describe as the development project.
Yeah.
You know, the kind of deeper the kind of deeper social cause that is meant to be underpinning this project is, there's no awareness of it, there's no consciousness of it, and that is not even being held. It's not even being held in a very conscious way. So the lives of organizations have been taken over by the development project and becoming, even those who say, oh no, we are not, even some of the bigger ones who say, oh no, we are not, but their lives have been taken over by being delivery vehicles. And when you look at the deeper social causes that should underpin the work of organizations, it's completely not given attention. So what happens is there's all this running around of getting things done. There is not enough time devoted to, you know, the social causes that we should be concerned about. Let me give you an example.
Please do.
You probably have read about Cape Town facing a water crisis. Yeah. So last year, when it really hit the city full on in the face, that, listen here, water as a resource is a scarce and it's limited, you know. We need to become a lot more conscious about how we use water, how we manage the use of water, etc., etc. As an organization, we you know, when you're faced with a social, when you're facing a crisis, you need to be responding if you're a social purpose organization.
Yeah.
So we responded in a particular way, and at that point in time, the best we could do was to say, listen here, we will connect to and mobilize leaders from the faith communities. We connected through St. George's Cathedral, and we managed to bring them together. But it wasn't a project. It didn't need to be a project. It didn't need to be a project. And some people were saying, oh, why don't you develop a project? And we kept on saying, no, we don't want to develop a project. We don't want it to be a project. We need a response. We would like to work and through conversation engage the faith, the leadership from the faith communities to say, how do we respond to this crisis that is facing our city, that is facing our country? And we became so aware of the fact that, well, if it's not a project, it's difficult to mobilize for people to be interested in it. And we thought, but people should be interested in it, you know. And the same applies to the challenges that South Africa is facing around the situation facing women in the country, from young girls to older women. I think it's no secret that this is a country where there's no real appreciation of women and the kind of things that women are subjected to. Women across the board. It's not just it's women from poor communities, it's women generally across the board. How women are treated in the corporate world, how women are treated in the sector, how women are treated in the civil society space, how poor women are treated, how highly educated women are treated, and just kind of a society where there is no appreciation, no respect for women. And people's response is always, when you say that, well, I am investing and I'm devoting my activism to the situation of women, then people will say, why don't you develop a project around it? And I'm like, please, let's not go there. Not everything is about a project. I mean, part of my frustration is even how the values that Nelson Mandela lived have now been projectized. If you know, it's crazy, and I don't think we will achieve building just societies if we just rely on development projects.
Yeah,
I think there's other things we need to be doing other things, or we need working differently, or there are other things that need to matter. Yeah.
The project is like a reduction to just like some inputs and outputs or something, isn't it? It's like there's something about the project that sucks in or sucks out. Maybe it sucks out the like actual conversation and relationship, and it reduces it to like these things that you put in and put out, and hopefully it works, and if it doesn't, try something else. That's great. Yeah,
it's precisely that. It reduces. It has so much power that it takes a very critical social cause and reduces it to outcomes and outputs and so that is where we are. And unless your organization is able to demonstrate to those with the resources, unless your organization is able to demonstrate, you stand no chance of attracting the kind of resources or resourcing that would make it possible for us to do the meaningful work.
Yeah, and so that's the, in a way, it's the biggest obstacle is the money, isn't it? Because the money is so tied to these projects.
Yeah.
The money is so tied to the idea of let's get a project and fix it and tick. Yeah. So what would we need in an ideal world, in your mind, in your view, to make? Go ahead.
Yeah, for me, I've been thinking a lot around the kind of collaborations we need to be cultivating, and I don't necessarily have all the answers, but I think we really need to begin to cultivate collaborations that are not built around projects.
Yeah.
Around social causes. If we collaborate around a social cause, we need to think not about our project objectives and all that, but then we need to say, what is our program of action? And how are we going to pursue our program of action? Because when you collaborate around social causes, I think you're able to find your way. You're able to find your way around developing and pursuing a program of action.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was able to see a little bit when CDRA was engaging the faith leaders from the faith community around the water crisis, it became about a program of action and not only about a project with outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
It also it allowed us to be a lot more innovative and creative in how we pursued a certain thing.
Mm-hmm.
And over that period of time, when we looked at when we looked at what were we able to really achieve, it was evident that bringing people together and creating space and opportunity for honest conversation, for honest dialogue, was a lot more important than any other thing. So
Mm-hmm.
it's really interesting. So how do we? And I know it's not always easy. We are grappling with that currently. That how do we actually build collaborations around social causes and not collaborations around projects, because we can see how collaborations around projects they can only go so far, but really contribute towards creating a just society. I don't know. It also, it requires an understanding of. My colleague Doug always says, we need to be very clear about what is the real work that is needed at this point in time.
Mm-hmm.
In South Africa, everybody will tell, most of the donors will say, oh, you need to be doing work in human rights work. You need to be doing work that is about fighting corruption. You need to be doing work that is about X, Y, and Z. And then these unfortunately are the kind of the focus areas that are getting funding support. But human rights work, the concept of human rights is very broad.
Yeah, right.
And often donors don't look at, they've got a particular framing and conception of human rights, and they are not open to looking beyond that. When you look of issues of dignity, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. In the South African context, yes, issues of corruption are real, and these are issues that need to be addressed. But where is the work, or where are the resources to support the healing work that is needed in this country?
Yeah.
There are no resources for that kind of work. And we're a society deeply in need of healing.
Mm.
As we what is it, reclaiming, rebuilding, whatever relationships of solidarity, there must be an element of doing work that heals.
Yeah.
That healing work needs to happen. And I often say to people, I don't care the resources that this country will try and invest in economic development.
Mm.
The heart of the matter is, if this country is not going to develop any resource, to invest any resources in healing processes, healing programs that are aimed at healing its people, there's no hope in hell that we'll get anywhere.
Yeah. And perhaps that's that's more true, in many contexts than any of the sort of mainstream thinking and development ever really addresses. Like, structural inequity in the world has had such an impact.
Yeah.
You know, so like if we don't address that, the healing that is required to meet some of the needs that emerge from this history of basically injustice and inequity, not just in South Africa but globally, then all this resource that we throw at a project to make people's lives better that has no healing component, I totally agree. I think that's often, you know, just a bit of sticking plaster, you know.
Absolutely. I mean, when we look at what's happening globally, I mean, what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Palestine, Israel, the migration challenge. When you look at what, at a global level, what the resources are available for, and when you look at the real work that is needed, when I say to people, actually, I don't even, you know, even for example, rebuilding Syria. Rebuilding Syria is not just going to be, an economic project. And that is what part of what needs to happen if we are to reclaim is not everything should be reduced to an economic or a political problem. Unless it's the kind of the human aspect is also part of that process, you know. You look at South Sudan, they've been at it for, that country had no chance. It had no, it was given an opportunity. And when you look at the resources that are invested in South Sudan, in political and economic solutions, it's not going to work. But if you were to set South Sudan on a path of healing and humanizing, I think those kind of peace-building processes would have a chance, you know, they would have some chance of getting them somewhere. So how do we ensure that this kind of dominance of political and economic agendas become the kind of the driving force of processes that we know, and we people in the world know that unless there's a humanizing element to these processes, it's not going to happen. If I look at South Africa, and for me this is one of the challenges, is the democratic project. Coming from apartheid South Africa, and the kind of ushering in the democratic dispensation. And we thought, if we become a democracy, we will be fine. And here we are in a democratic South Africa, and we are like, hello, now what's happening? We
we didn't mean it like this way.
No. This wasn't our understanding of what was going to happen. So we made assumptions. We made assumptions about a democracy, the democratic project, and we made assumptions that with democracy, the growing humanity, the creation of a just society, these would be things that kind of they would flow out of that. And here we are seeing things that things are happening in the country, and we are like, well, this is not what we fought for. So how do we even, and I don't want to claim that, you know, we know everything or we have the answers, but we can see that when we work with organizations, when you are able to facilitate these kind of humanizing processes that get people to look each other to look at each other, to accept each other, to treat each other as human beings, even in a space as small as a single organization. It brings a different quality to the organization, and it puts the work of the organization in a different perspective. Yeah. How do we achieve that in our big world? How do we achieve that in society? So how do we make these humanizing processes, how do we make them part of our everyday? Part of how we live, part of how we engage, part of what matters. How do we make it part of our real work? Because the world in which we live there isn't always space for these kinds of processes. And unless we are able to do that, you know, I don't think there's any hope for us to begin to cultivate these relationships of solidarity. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's the hard work that needs to be done. And last month we were at a one-day masterclass seminar that was offered by Margaret Whitley. Mm-hmm. And I think some people were very deflated because people were saying, we're doing this work to change the world. And he said, forget about global change, global systems change. You're not going to, now forget about that. That is not going to happen. But it's a challenge of working locally, working with what you have, mm-hmm. working locally, and doing the best. Mm-hmm. Even doing the best with even the resources that you have. And we are now trying to explore a lot more deeply what it means for CDRA to work locally. It doesn't mean that, and what is the work? What is the work that is needed at this point in time? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how do we go about doing that work, and how do we even kind of stimulate an appetite for that kind of work, and what are the kinds of relationships we need to be building at a global level, mm-hmm. With others to make sure that this work at a local level gets done in ways that are meaningful. Mm. So these are some of the reflections. These are some of the things that we are grappling with. These are some of the things that I am grappling with on a very personal and on an individual level. So this question around how do we build collaborations around social causes and not around projects? Mm. Mm. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels like that's like the central shift that we're seeing in this conversation, like needs to happen, right? It feels like the project feels like an obstacle, you know? Yeah. And I definitely see that too. Like somehow it gets in the way of all the rest of this. And, you know, knowing that we can't do everything, knowing that we don't even see the whole of what might need to happen to create the things we care about. But like the small actions we take, like taking them out of the project. And you're not the first person that said that to me in these conversations. So it does feel very, very pertinent for this time. Like almost what needs to happen. Maybe we need to be letting go of projects.
And can we even begin to reimagine organization whose work is beyond the development project?
Yeah.
And what does that mean for the CDRA? Mm. You know, what does it mean for our organizations working beyond the development project? Yeah.
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 And how do we, what is the education?
Mm-hmm.
Education that is required for those with the resources and the money to support development. What is the education, kind of, the re-education of donors and funders? Yeah.
Yeah, in order to make some of these shifts possible. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's like you said, so little resource available for things that aren't a project. So
Yeah.
yeah, that feels like something important for donors to consider and wake up to, even, I would say. that the real change happens in other ways.
Yeah, exactly. Real change happens in other ways. Real change happens through other processes. Real change doesn't only happen through a project with outcomes and outputs and etc. Yeah.
Yeah. So I love that. And I think maybe on that note, I'll ask you, is there anything else you'd like to share, or does that feel complete right now?
I without, the one thing that really kind of we've been grappling with in the CDRA is it's these humanizing processes.
Yeah.
Right? How do we? What more do we need to do, or what more do we need? What do we need to pay attention to? What's the kind of work that will help us to do to achieve or what should we be thinking about when we work with these humanizing processes? And kind of the connection to what you have just said, real change happens in other ways.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't only happen. So those of us who are working with humanizing processes, we need to think a lot more about how do we bring these processes and what are the spaces into which we can bring these processes. Yeah. And it's not easy. It's not easy, and we haven't quite found. We are going into a kind of a strategy conversation next month. We'll be looking at some of these things. That real change happens in other ways. What are the ways in which change is happening, and how does one connect? How do you connect to the points of change?
Mm-hmm.
It's happening all the time. We don't bring it. We don't make it.
Yeah, the ones we try and make are tricky, but the ones that happen,
very tricky.
Yeah.
But and the last thing, and we don't have a solution. It's this thing of what is the kind of the re-education of those with the resources.
Yeah.
If we were to engage donors and not alone, together with others, what are the issues around which we need to be engaging them?
Yeah.
We definitely need to engage them. We can't sit back, Marianne, and say things will happen. Yeah.
And it's how we engage them around this humanizing. I like that way you put it, that the humanizing agenda, in a way that includes them, that invites them to include themselves, rather than feels like we're saying,
you are the bad guys.
Yeah.
We don't want to say to them, you are the bad guys, but we want to say, listen here, together we need to be. How do we do it in collaboration with them? Yeah. How
do we do it differently?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the space is hard, but there are so many opportunities within the space.
Yeah.
It's also just about finding our courage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
To do. Yeah.
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 Yeah. I love that. Thank
Yeah.
you so much, Nomvula. I so enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah. And if anything comes up, I'll connect with you, and then we can probably take the conversation further.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I'd love to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time today. And
until tomorrow, when we are actually celebrating Nelson Mandela's birthday, and all this talk about the man's values, and I am like, please, the old man is resting. Can we open up spaces for new, younger leadership to emerge? But you can see that as a country, we're still kind of completely stuck at looking for heroic leaders and not opening up the space for leadership to emerge. We even brought the other heroic leader. The Nelson Mandela Foundation brought the other heroic leader, Barack Obama, to come and give the address.
Okay.
What's wrong with the world and heroic leadership? Anyhow, thanks very much, Marianne.
You're so welcome. Thank you. I think it's an important thing to end on. You know, heroic leadership is often our, you know, mighty and great though the works of or the writings or whatever ideas of those men might be, there's something about that you know, that we need to get over.
We need to get over it. I was saying, look at, for example, just to look at the football World Cup. The president of Croatia, a woman, took a week off work, unpaid leave, to go and support her team, didn't stay in a 5-star hotel, sat amongst the fans in the stands, didn't sit in the special places, right? But there's no appreciation for that kind of leadership.
Yeah.
No, there's no appreciation. People are still looking for, at least in my part of the world, they're still looking for heroic leaders.
Yeah.
So bring another heroic leader to talk about another heroic leader, and we're completely stuck in the past. Anyhow, thank you very much.
Thank you. You've been listening to me, Marianne Clements, in conversation with Nomvula Dlamini, and this is part of the Healing Solidarity Conference. Thanks for being with us today. If you'd like to spend more time with the thoughts and suggestions we discussed in this talk or any of the others in the conference, don't forget that you can make a contribution to support the production of this event and get access to recordings and ongoing conversations about these themes and ideas. Just click on the link below the video to find out more. Thank you.